Hey everyone, all of Eldritch Moon was spoiled earlier today, and as always, the end of spoiler season means it's the beginning of limited review week here on my channel. What that means is that every day for the next week until the pre-release, I will be bringing you guys a new video discussing Eldritch Moon as a limited format. The first 5 of these videos, as always, will be my discussion of the best commons and uncommons in each color, and as always, we're going to be starting with white. Also, if you're looking for some more general tips about limited, you should check out my video on my top 10 tips for succeeding in any limited format, which you should see an annotation for now. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about what I think is the best white uncommon. I think the best white uncommon is pretty clearly Blessed Alliance. This card is kind of insane. And the reason it is because it's good at every stage of the game. In the early game, it can kill your opponent's attacking creature, which depending on the board state, oftentimes is just going to be their best creature. Granted, people can play around this by not attacking with their best creature. And on top of that, it scales in the later part of the game. You can use it to untap 2 creatures, which means you can then also allow yourself to block some of your opponent's other attackers. The sort of non-bo there is that you untap your creatures, your opponent can see how you want to block and then sacrifice one of the creatures you were going to block anyway, but that's not like a huge problem. It doesn't make the card less good. It just means you're not always going to be getting like 3-for-1s or things like that. And you can also gain 4 life. Obviously, that's the weakest aspect of the card, but if you're doing all 3 of those things, that's a pretty amazing turn. And the fact that it's flexible, the fact that you can leave 2 mana up and get 1 of these effects, 4 mana up and get 2 of these effects, or 6 to get 3 is pretty great. Leaving 6 up is a pretty good sign if you're playing someone that they may have Blessed Alliance and you're about to get blown out, but they could also be bluffing. So this is the kind of card that's powerful enough that you want to play around it, though. I think it's going to be first pickable in most packs, and I don't think there's another white uncommon that I would say is that highly pickable, and that's why I think Blessed Alliance is sort of uncontested as the best white uncommon. I did have a few other white uncommons I wanted to talk about, though, that I think are at least worthy of discussion because they're pretty good. One of these is Drogskol Shieldmate. It just does a lot for the mana you pay. A 3-mana 2/3 with Flash is already a reasonable card, but the fact that he can pump your whole team, their toughness anyway, is pretty great too. This usually means Drogskol Shieldmate can get you a 2-for-1. Whether you are flashing him in to negate a removal spell that does an amount of damage or gives -X, he can make sure that you have a creature survive that if all you need is 1 more toughness. He can also make an attack that for your opponent looked like a trade, no longer a trade. And both of those make it easy for him to be a 2-for-1 because then later he can trade for something or he has to eat a removal spell. On top of that, he also has Spirit Synergies, which isn't irrelevant, especially because he actually works very well with the Spirit from Shadows over Innistrad, who can bounce spirits to your hand, because obviously you can use his ability over and over again. It's not the most powerful ability ever to use over and over again, but it's not an irrelevant one either. Subjugator Angel is another uncommon I think is worth talking about. She has a pretty high casting cost at 6, but she has a decent body as a 4/3 flyer, especially coupled with a somewhat powerful ability that makes all of your opponent's creatures get tapped, meaning that suddenly if there's a board stall, you just won the game most likely, or at least you're going to get very close to doing so. I wouldn't pick either Drogskol Shieldmate or Subjugator Angel super highly, but they're both cards that I think if you're playing white, any white deck, you'll say, yeah, sure, I'll take one of these and happily put it into your deck. And I think that means they're fairly high-quality uncommons. The next card I want to talk about is Faith Unbroken. It's a card I would like to like even more because I love removal, as you know if you've watched my videos. But it has problems. It has a very high power level, admittedly. And in a world where everything goes just how you want it to, Faith Unbroken is amazing. Now, what makes that a problem is things aren't usually, or at least not always, going to go the way you want them to exactly. Because Faith Unbroken is an aura, it's not as strong as predecessors like Oblivion Ring or Journey to Nowhere, because it exiles something, yes, when it comes into play, but if it leaves play, your opponent gets that creature back. And if you're using an aura, it's the easiest kind of enchantment for your opponent to remove. They can kill your creature one way or another, and then they get their creature back. Now, I think the power level of the card is very high, and I think if you're playing, you have to be careful with it. I think you have to be playing in such a way that you don't want to be playing this if your opponent has mana untapped, basically, especially if it's mana that can produce a removal spell to just 2-for-1 you right off the bat. And if you're doing that, I think it can still be a pretty big swing. I mean, it's worth noting it also pumps your creature. I mean, I'm sort of leaving that out. but it has its weaknesses. I think it has a high power level, though. I think most white decks will play it. I'm just saying don't take it highly and don't expect things to always go well. What makes Drogskol, Shield Maiden, Subjugator, Angel better than Faith Unbroken is the fact that their fail cases are just that you have a decent-bodied creature for your cost, and Faith Unbroken can be a 2-for-1. I mean, that's a pretty big downside. It may have a higher ceiling than either of them, but it also has by far the lowest floor. So let's go ahead and talk about the best commons now that we've talked about some uncommons. The commons are sort of the bread and butter cards of the draft. They're the cards that you're going to see the most, and they're also the kinds of cards that will serve as excellent signals about a color being open because you're just going to see more of them. And the ones that we're discussing on each of these lists, beginning here with the white one, are pretty strong, and thus I think are pretty good signals that white would be open. The third best white common, I think, is Desperate Sentry. If you've watched my other limited review videos or watched me draft, you know I absolutely love value, and Desperate Sentry gives you some of that. It's a 3-mana 1/2, which is obviously bad, but the fact that he gives you a 3/2 body when he dies, ideally, in the most ideal world possible, after you find a way to trade with an X1, and then it's a very good card because it's a 2-for-1. But that already makes him a pretty good card. If he's just a 3-mana 1/2 who puts a 3/2 into play, I probably play at least one of those in most white decks that I build and feel okay about it. He's certainly not amazing. But on top of that, he actually scales in the later part of the game because he has Delirium. As we saw in Shadows of Innistrad, getting Delirium isn't that hard. Granted, white does need to be often anyway, paired with either green or black to really get Delirium effectively. But Delirium's not that hard to get, and in the later part of the game, this becomes a 3-mana 4/3 who leaves a 3/2 behind, which is obviously even better. So he scales in the later parts of the game, he's solid in the early game, and I think that's a card that I like. You know, he can frequently be a 2-for-1, and those are things that always make me happy in Limited. At number 2, I have Guardian Priest. I didn't think they'd ever reprint Master Decoy at common, since it's always an oppressive common, but they got pretty close here. But I think they did the right thing design-wise to make it not quite as oppressive as Master Decoy has been. It has a subpar body, 2 mana for a 1/2, actually just like Master Decoy, but it has a powerful activated ability, once again just like Master Decoy, in that it can tap down creatures. Now what makes it different is it says non-human creatures, and humans are an incredibly common creature type, so it's not going to be able to tap down everything, and against some decks it's actually going to be able to not tap down most of their creatures, so that is a bit of a downside. However, it can do it for 1 colorless mana. Master Decoy needed 1 white mana, so maybe it evens out a little bit. But I still think it's a very good card despite not being able to tap humans, and that's because a lot of decks aren't going to have a ton of humans in them. Most decks aren't, in fact, and almost no decks are going to have 0 humans in them. It'll almost always have things to tap. It'll almost always give you ways to really get tempo advantage on your opponent. If you're paying 1 mana every turn to tap down their 5-mana creature, you're doing a pretty good job on the board. And it also has human synergies itself, because it's a human, it can be pumped by things that pump humans. Any sort of human synergies work well with it, in addition to it already having a very powerful ability. I could actually see Guardian Priest by the end of this format shifting all the way to number 1 if it turns out that the non-human thing is even less of a deal than I'm thinking it is. But for now, I have it at number 2, and at number 1, I have sort of the safer pick, which is just a very good removal spell, Choking Restraints. This is the premium white removal spell at common in the format. There's usually a premium-ish spell in every color at common, and that's what Choking Restraint is. It's a bad pacifism, sort of. I mean, I'll mention how it's a little different than pacifism, but basically, pacifism costs 2 for the same basic effect. Enchanted creature can't attack or block. That would already be a very high-quality card. I think that would probably still be the best common for me, in the early goings, just looking at the set as I am now. But it also has a little bit of upside. In the latter part of the game, you can exile creatures with annoying static or activated abilities. And if you don't usually want to have 5 mana up, but if you do, your opponent can't really use a removal spell on Choking Restraints like an Enchantment Destroyer because you'll just exile their creature anyway. So that's sort of another little bit of upside that it has. There's also a little bit more of an enchantment theme in green and white. We saw sort of a tiny bit of that in Shadows of Innistrad, but more of it has come into play with Eldritch Moon, and that gives Choking Restraints a little bit more of an edge as well. But I think that it is the best common at this point, even without any sort of synergies or anything like that. So that does it for my picks for the best white commons and uncommons for Eldritch Moon Limited. What do you think of my picks? Am I overrating or underestimating anything? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you want to make sure to catch the rest of my Eldritch Moon Limited review, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.